Hi, everybody, and the webinar on COVID-19 and the rights of the webinar very soon. Please for 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we'll begin. Hi again, everyone. I'll hear a lot of the chimes as well. Everybody that be trying to able to. However, you can type in box or the questions box, and then you'll be called on as the webinar progresses. But we'll begin in just about a minute. Thanks. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I think we're just about ready to start. Just a reminder that if you are muted, that means you're automatically muted when you join. You can use the chat box or the questions box to enter any information or any questions or comments that you would like. We'll begin in a few seconds. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on COVID-19 and the impact on the rights of migrants. We're very, very pleased as the Civil Society Action Committee to welcome you alongside ICVA, International Council for Voluntary Agencies, and IMBR, International Migrants Bill of Rights, who are co-organizers for this webinar as part of a series of this. So we really want to kind of just give a really quick introduction on how this has come about. This webinar actually follows a series of things that we've been doing since the COVID-19 pandemic has hit, one of which is also a statement which we developed in conjunction with all of our members and reviews, and has over 300 sign-ons at the moment, which have been circulating widely. And the statement covers a wide range of issues around COVID-19 and the impact of migrants in general, but especially it's based on the rights of migrants and how this is impacting, and some recommendations on how we may move forward. Based on that, then we also thought we could have a webinar focusing on specific aspects of this, and we're really pleased to welcome some exciting speakers with us today, which we'll go through in a second. We also want to just give you a quick reminder again that we have everybody's large webinar. We have around 250 people attending at the moment and expecting more to join us soon. We have everybody automatically muted. If you'd like to have a comment or question, we suggest you use the questions chat box so that you can ask your questions. And then as we go through after the speakers, we'll have 1 or 2 rounds of verbal questions and comments where we'll be unmuting specific people and calling on your questions. But our speakers will also be actively answering your questions in the chat box in order to maximize the time. And we'll have a quick round of speakers, which Michele, my colleague, will introduce shortly. But just a reminder for all participants to use the chat box actively during the entire webinar. With that, I turn to Michele to introduce the webinar in detail and introduce the panelists. Michele?
Yes, thank you very much, Colin. And I would like to start by thanking all the colleagues that joined us today, and greetings everywhere you are. Now, of course, to prevent the spread of COVID-19 pandemic, states are undertaking a large number of measures. And from the point of view of international law, it is crucial first that these measures are not discriminatory, and secondly, then when they provide for derogations or when they limit our human rights, such derogations and limitations are allowed under international law, which means also that they are necessary, proportional, and open for legal review. This webinar, as you mentioned, Colin, focuses in specific on the impact of COVID-19 on the rights of migrants, and this is for a number of reasons. First, in some occasions, migrants are particularly exposed to COVID-19 infections risks. Some time ago, the Action Committee drafted this statement on the protection of migrants against COVID-19, and it highlights very well some of the risks that migrants are exposed to, and also provides for recommendations to protect the migrants against such risks. Migrants are often in front line. They are health workers, taxi drivers, sellers in shops, and it is crucial that they get full access to all preventive and responsive measures required. It is also important that migrants receive all the information on COVID-19 and how to protect against it in the language that they understand well. It is also some groups of migrants that are more at risk regarding their right to health and life. And I refer here to migrants who are in detention centers or in other overcrowded settings. Migrants in irregular situation might also not be entitled based on national laws to access medical assistance and hospitals, or might fear to do so as they think they could be detained and deported. We have also many situations where migrant workers work in the informal sectors, and with the measures in place, they are deprived from their incomes and not entitled to any state support schemes. Another reason for this focus today is also that states have closed borders in many situations, which also means that the right to seek international protection has become additional challenging, and many asylum seekers, migrants, and foreigners find themselves stranded without adequate protection, healthcare, and resources where they are. So it is to discuss all these challenging solutions, but also some already existing good practices in terms of policies, but also concrete actions undertaken by states and civil society, that we are organizing this webinar today. And I am very grateful to our excellent panelists for their availability and willingness to share with us today. And I would like to briefly introduce all of them. So we have with us as a panelist, the Ambassador Omar Hilale, who is since 2014 the permanent representative of the Kingdom of Morocco to the United Nations in New York. In this position, the Ambassador Hilale is vice presiding the ECOSOC and is in charge of the humanitarian segment. Prior to this position, he was permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva. He's a long-standing diplomat and has worked both in Morocco at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as has served his country as ambassador in various locations, including Indonesia, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand. Thank you very much and welcome, Your Excellency. As the second panelist, we have Michele LeVoy, who is the director of PICUM, Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants. And Michele is well known by most of you. In addition to being director of PICUM, she's also in the advisory board of many other migration-related initiatives. I would mention here the Civil Society Days of the Global Forum on Migration and Development, the Global Coalition on Migration, and the Women in Migration Network. Thank you, Michele. Welcome. In addition to Michele, we have also Ivonne Garza, who is an institute associate at the Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. She's a legal professional, and prior to joining the institute, Ivonne worked as a human rights specialist at the Rapporteurship on the Rights of Migrants of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Additionally, she worked at the Center for Justice and International Law, leading the Americas Network on Nationality and Statelessness, and participated on strategic litigation on diverse cases at the international level. The last panelist is Jan Matthew Kysel, who is a visiting assistant clinical professor of law and teaches the Asylum and Convention Against Torture Appellate Clinic at Cornell Law School. He's also a co-founder and directs the work of the International Migrants Bill of Rights Initiative. In addition to holding various academic posts, Jan also argues and participates in litigations before immigrations, federal and state courts, as well as international tribunals. And though not announced it before, I will also give the floor today to one participant from the Mixed Migration Center, and this is because of a very relevant initiative that they have undertaken. And Roberto Forin, who is the Program Global Coordinator of the Mixed Migration Center, will introduce us to this initiative. So thank you again to all the panelists. I just want to make sure that the ambassador can hear us. We had some difficulties with some of the participants' connection, so I would just want to make sure that all the panelists can unmute themselves and we can hear them. Your Excellency, Ambassador, do you hear us? So I think he has a small issue with the settings. The colleagues are trying to repair that, and maybe we'll hear from the ambassador later on. And I suggest we start maybe with the next panelist. I would like to give the floor to Michele LeVoy from PICUM. PICUM it's very well known by many of you. It plays an important role also because of a vulnerable position that undocumented migrants might find themselves into, especially now in this situation. So, Michele, based on the work of PICUM, what are the main concerns? Yes, we have the ambassador.
Yes, I'm hearing
Perfect.
you now very well. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Perfect. So, Mr. Ambassador, it's a pleasure to have you join us and welcome. Of course, I mean, Morocco is a very important country when talking migration. It is a country of origin, transit, and increasingly a destination country as well. So a lot of responsibility to the state authorities in terms of migration governance. And we all know about the strong civil society that you have in Morocco. So would like very much to hear from you, Mr. Ambassador, about the measures taken by Morocco to prevent and respond to COVID-19 and the specific attention paid to protection of migrants.
Thank you very much, dear Michele. First of all, good afternoon, Geneva, and I'm very happy to be with you. I would like to thank you for your kind words about my presentation and also about what Morocco is doing to assist and to help migrants in this very difficult time of COVID-19. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me first to thank the International Council for Voluntary Agencies, the Civil Society Action Committee, and the International Migration Bill of Rights for inviting me to this webinar. It is indeed a very timely meeting. In fact, the COVID-19 pandemic is an unprecedented, unconventional, and life-altering challenge. As described by the Secretary General of the United Nations, COVID-19 is a global human crisis which took away the lives of many, strained healthcare system, and hits economies very hard. Populations in vulnerable situations and marginalized segments of the societies are at the heart of this pandemic. Migrants in particular face multiple challenges due to COVID-19 with unique economic, social, and health dimensions. As a matter of fact, migrants are hardly affected by the diverse direct and indirect impacts of COVID-19. Migrants, especially those in lower paid jobs, are both more affected by and vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19. On the one hand, migrants tend to be more vulnerable to loss of employment and wages during an economic crisis. On the other hand, as workers in critical and essential sectors, they are exposed to higher risk of contracting the virus. One other important aspect of the impact of this pandemic on migrants is remittances. We all know how remittances are a vital source of income for developing countries. The economic crisis induced by the COVID-19 pandemic will drive a sharp decline of global remittances due to a fall in wages and employment of migrant workers. This decline is projected by the World Bank to be about 20% in 2020. It could be the sharpest fall in recent history. Last but not least, measures taken by states to face this pandemic can result in putting migrants at higher risk of abuses and violation of their rights. It is therefore of the utmost importance that all relevant actors, locally, internationally, regionally, and internationally, take into account the specific needs of migrants and their particular situation in their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In this regard, the Marrakesh Compact on migration is more important than ever. It provides a set of guidelines that could ensure that migrants' rights are protected and that measures taken by states do not hinder their well-being or threatens their livelihoods. Aware of the importance of this compact in these difficult circumstances, Morocco has been among the first advocates to incorporating a COVID-19 perspective in the implementation of the provisions of the compact, this compact. Morocco, as member of the steering committee of the Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund, has defended this approach in the selection of projects that would be funded. For my part, as chair of the Humanitarian Affairs segment of ECOSOC, scheduled from 9 to 11 June 2020, I envisage two initiatives specific to COVID-19, which will include refugees, migrants, and internally displaced persons. A high-level panel on addressing the increasing complexity of health challenges in humanitarian contexts, which will be convened during the segment and which focus on the humanitarian impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the call to action in support of the humanitarian response in the context of COVID-19, which I intend to launch during this segment. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Morocco's response to the COVID-19 pandemic was based on 5 principles set by His Majesty the King Mohammed VI: solidarity, anticipation, prevention, a holistic approach, and prioritizing citizens with a particular emphasis on the most vulnerable. In this context, migrants and refugees residing in Morocco are included in Morocco's response plan to COVID-19, which is fully in line with Morocco's commitments toward migration and migrants, illustrated by one of the most human and migrant-centered policies launched by His Majesty the King. In general, Morocco's measures to face this pandemic aim at improving its health system and mitigating the socio-economic impacts of the crisis. In this regard, Morocco was among the first countries to close its airspace and has declared the state of health emergency when the first cases were detected. In the same vein, Morocco channeled the available internal resources toward the COVID-19 Special Fund, created on the initiative of His Majesty the King, worth so far more than $3.5 billion. Thanks to this fund, more than 5.1 million households, many of which operate in the informal sector, were able to benefit from direct financial subsidies. Furthermore, Morocco mobilized their national industry to produce personal protective equipment, namely millions of masks produced locally. As concrete examples, Morocco managed to produce more than 83 million masks and has manufactured respiratory devices, where there is a great shortage on a global scale. Morocco has also built the largest field hospital in Africa with a capacity of more than 700 beds. At the regional level and in line with the kingdom's long-standing spirit of solidarity, His Majesty King Mohammed VI launched an initiative aiming at creating an operational framework to work with African countries in the fight against the pandemic. It is the African countries in the fight. It is pragmatic and action-oriented initiatives dedicated to sharing experiences and best practices to deal with the health, economic, and social impact of the pandemic. By adopting a proactive policy based on effective measures to deal with the COVID-19, Morocco has been able to curb the massive spread of this virus and flatten its curve. Efforts at all levels will continue in the coming weeks, even months, to face this pandemic and its medium and long-term socio-economic impacts. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that today's world still needs to work harder in order to be more and better prepared for such crises. This pandemic has proven that cooperation, solidarity, unity, and multilateralism are key elements for any successful response to worldwide crisis. While the world seems to be recovering little by little from this pandemic, its long-term impacts are only starting now. We therefore need to redouble our efforts to preserve the development gains and progress and made so far in the fight against precariousness and poverty, which has hard hit by this pandemic. We also need to ensure that all components of society, in particular those in vulnerable situations, such as migrants, recover from the devastation caused by COVID-19. In other words, we should make sure that no one is left behind. I thank you very much for your kind attention, man.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and it was indeed a very interesting presentation because you shared with us the principles of interventions and the policies undertaken in Morocco. Then you gave also some concrete examples of the measures undertaken, and then you also put it into a more long-term perspective, looking at the impact that this pandemic will have on the most vulnerable, including migrants. And I'm sure there would be some questions in the chat box for you, Your Excellency, as well. I just wanted to share with all the participants that the discussion is being recorded, and we'll share the links with you after the meeting, so you can hear the discussion and share it further within your networks. Your Excellency, you spoke in general about the consequences and the impact of COVID-19 on the migrants. I wanted now to continue with the second panelist for today, Michele. As I was mentioning before, Michele, PICUM looks in specific at the rights of undocumented migrants who are very often in a more vulnerable position because of a migration status. So based on the work of PICUM so far, what are the main concerns from a right-based perspective on the impact of COVID-19 on undocumented migrants, Michele?
Thank you, Michele, and thank you very much for the organization of this webinar and the framing. And it's nice to see so many people participating from different parts of the world. In terms of the impact on undocumented, I would like to highlight three brief concerns. And some of this touches upon what you and others have already said in the introduction. So the first one is migrants who are living in poverty. We've seen amongst our membership, which is largely based in Europe, although we do have some members also just outside of the EU's borders, that many of our members said that undocumented are facing huge problems of poverty and an increased level of poverty due to the pandemic. We have reports that some are going hungry, including children. And this is also mainly because a lot of people have lost their jobs because they were working in precarious situations and they lost their jobs when the pandemic occurred, like many others have lost their jobs, or they are working in precarious situations because they need to survive. When they've lost their jobs, we see that systematically undocumented are excluded from unemployment benefits and national payment schemes during COVID. I'll say a little bit more about that later. We often see that when they're working, they're in vital, underregulated sectors with no option to work from home or ability to stay at a distance, such as agriculture, food delivery, domestic work, cleaning, where there's a lot of risks. And it was also interesting recently in our member group on labor, we did a word cloud where you can type in kind of what are some things that you're noticing in your work. And the members were saying that 4 of the most recurrent impacts of COVID on undocumented are exploitation, homelessness, health risks at work, and destitution. And that kind of brings me to the second key area of concern is limited or no access to services and support. So as mentioned in the opening, undocumented often fear going to get access to healthcare because they could be reported to the immigration authorities. And this is a fear throughout the year, but this is more acute in COVID, where there have been, for example, a case in the UK of a man who was undocumented who had symptoms of COVID, but he died at home because he feared going to the doctor because of the hostile environment in the UK. We've also seen numerous reports, including from the UN Population Fund, that indicated that there's a 20% increase in gender-based violence in all 193 UN member states. So this means undocumented women are also concerned by this increase in gender-based violence. And we've heard from our members kind of 2 scenarios. Some have been worried because they usually receive calls from undocumented women the whole year who want to escape, who want to find a way to report their aggressors, and they're receiving fewer calls, which means that women are, like other women now, stuck with their abusers in lockdown. And we've also received notice from members that there's a problem with interpretation and translation. So where they can actually go to the authorities to report this, they cannot be accompanied by other people, and they can't get translation of documents. So these are also key concerns. And the third area of concern is immigration detention, and this was also mentioned in the beginning. In the past 2 months, during the height of the pandemic, NGOs and the Council of Europe, the UN Human Rights Office, IOM, UNHCR, the World Health Organization have all released calls to release migrants in detention for 2 reasons. I would say, especially for the health concerns because of being in such closed quarters, and this is obviously very easy for the pandemic to proliferate in closed quarters, but also because when there is no reasonable prospect of removal, detention is unlawful under international human rights law. And I would also underline that this is stated in the Action Committee statement on COVID. We've seen in the European context that there are countries that are continuing to detain migrants during the pandemic, and the conditions are terrible, including in the Greek islands. And also there are access questions of those who are detained. So in Bulgaria, for example, all court proceedings of migrants who were detained have been suspended, which means that people who appealed their detention or their prolongation orders wouldn't have them reviewed, or they would simply just remain in detention. So this point on access to people in detention has also been an issue.
Thank you, Michele. Great to hear such an in-depth presentation about the many challenges that undocumented migrants experience today. The point about immigration detention and how it further aggravates the situation of migrants nowadays is it's of course very, very important. It would be interesting, in addition to hearing these concerns, to see also a bit in terms of measures undertaken by the governments and discuss with you if there are already some existing good practices by the governments. The ambassador expressed himself about the measures undertaken in Morocco. Of course, the situation is not perfect, but the government has paid attention to the most vulnerable groups. Could you share, Michele, some other examples of governments undertaking specific protective measures for migrants in terms of COVID-19 response?
Yes, thank you. We've actually been monitoring this, and we've found that there are a number of different types of measures, and I'd like to group them in 5 different areas. So the first one would be something I would call measures that are more social protection measures. Here I would put Portugal, which announced the plans to grant residence status to everyone with a pending residence application on any ground until the 1st of July, 2020. So this means that those people who had applied during the specific time period and up until the 1st of July will have the ability to access healthcare and all other public services on equal terms as any other permanent resident in Portugal. Ireland also has something somewhat similar. So in Ireland, undocumented have been granted full access to social welfare and healthcare, and authorities also confirmed that there would be no data sharing between service providers and immigration officers. So there would be a firewall principle. In addition, undocumented workers who have lost their job due to COVID would be able to apply for the pandemic unemployment payment. So when I just said earlier that we have seen undocumented systematically excluded from any government benefits, Ireland is the only example, the only exception that we found on the national level. We've also found that in the United States, on the state level, California has a measure to offer payments to undocumented, as well as New York City. And in Europe, some private foundations have stepped in to work with local NGOs to also offer a limited kind of pandemic payment to undocumented. The second grouping is extension of residence permits. We have seen that 7 EU member states, Greece, Ireland, Italy, France, Luxembourg, Poland, and Slovakia, have automatically extended the validity of all residence permits expiring during the lockdown. And in Slovenia, migrants in return procedures have been released and granted a temporary permit, which is valid for up to 6 months. The third area is regularization. And I think that the big news here has been the agreement last week in Italy to adopt a measure that can potentially regularize up to 600,000 undocumented workers in the agriculture and caregiving sectors to address labor shortages due to the lockdown measures. The details are still being, in a sense, defined and worked out, but workers may be able to access a work permit if they are in work or have an offer of work, or a temporary permit to look for work. In Belgium, there has been numerous calls from civil society to regularize undocumented people, also including those who might have serious medical illnesses and who would have difficulty in getting treatment if they would be returned to their countries of origin. Several MPs in France have also been discussing a potential regularization. And in Spain, the Barcelona City Council asked the national government to take action on residence permits. The fourth area is release from immigration detention. This has also been very notable in terms of what has occurred from states to release undocumented from immigration detention. So in Spain, almost all immigration detainees have been released, and they've been provided accommodation in state-funded reception programs that are run by NGOs. Hundreds of people have been released in the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy. And obviously, while that's positive, it's also important to see how people have been released, have then been transitioned into other shelters or housing. So Spain, the government worked with this network of NGOs to provide the accommodation. However, in Belgium and the UK, a number of NGOs noted that migrants who were released from detention were left in destitution and homelessness. And the last one that I wanted to mention are forced returns. We've noted in 10 EU member states, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Lithuania, Malta, and Slovakia, that forced returns were suspended or significantly reduced. So we kind of see all of these measures as promising in terms of trying to find other solutions for people during the pandemic, and also ways to look at residence permits and regularization.
Thank you so much, Michele. It's great to hear about these concrete initiatives undertaken by the governments. Let's hope that these initiatives will continue also after we put under control the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm speaking here about initiatives such as those regarding firewalls, but also regularization initiatives, and of course, non-immigration detention. I had one more question for you, Michele, but I see we are running a bit out of time, so maybe I can include that with the questions of the participants as well. And I would like now to give the floor to the coordinator of the Mixed Migration Center to tell us a bit the specific initiatives that they have related to COVID-19. As I think it's very relevant for the subject of the discussion of this webinar. The floor is yours, Roberto. We heard you, yes?
Yes, thank you. I was waiting to be unmuted by the organizer. It's quite a strange feeling. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for organizing this webinar. So yes, I wanted to introduce a little bit our activity, data collection activity linked to COVID, and then give you a sense of what we are seeing, perhaps very quickly, and then for more information you can always refer to our publication. So the Mixed Migration Center since few years has been conducting interview with migrants and refugees along a main migration route in different regions. Since the COVID-19 global pandemic, we decided to adapt our data collection activity. First of all, we needed to switch from face-to-face to remote interview for the safety of people we interview as well as enumerators. And secondly, we decided, at least for a period of time, to focus our data collection effort in looking specifically at the impact of COVID-19 in the initial phase, which is still ongoing, on the direct consequences of COVID on the sort of day-to-day life and partially the mobility of refugees and migrants. So we developed a survey of approximately 70 questions covering a bit of information about profile journey, but most importantly, impact of COVID, namely to what extent people are aware of the COVID-19, what are the risks for them and for the others, the measure that have been taken by refugees and migrants to protect themselves and the others again, the source of information that they rely on to access information on COVID, both prevention and remedy. Of course, access to healthcare, particularly looking at what the barriers are, if any, to accessing healthcare. Then assistance, we have been trying to understand what kind of assistance need exist, and then what are the gaps, and then the impact on day-to-day life and on the journey that the pandemic and the sort of government restriction that they put in place have had for refugees and migrants. We, as I said, been collecting information remotely, which means by telephone, using our existing network of monitor. We have different modalities to recruit participants remotely through third parties. If you need more information, you can consult our website. We explain a little bit how we are going in terms of methodology approach. We are collecting data in, as we speak, 1 to 5 regions. As of now, we have collected, I checked just before this call, 3,229 interviews, of which in West Africa, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, approximately 850, approximately 1,500 in North Africa, Libya, Tunisia, approximately 200 in Asia, Indonesia, India, and Malaysia. We have been conducting data collection also for returnees, but only in Afghanistan. We have conducted approximately 300 interviews. And then in Latin America, in Colombia and Peru, 400 interviews. And in Kenya and Somalia, in East Africa, we have been conducting so far approximately 100 interviews. So this is about what we do and how we do it. For more information, as I said, go on the website or drop me a line. Now, in terms of what we are seeing, we are publishing every 2 weeks global updates, where we do present all the data that we've been collecting in different regions. And then the regions are themselves producing a snapshot, focusing on their specific region holistically, or sometime on a specific aspect. So I'm going to give you, go through the main finding of the last global update, which we published the 12th of May, and then early next week we are publishing the 3rd. So actually quite a lot of our findings resonate quite a lot with what has been said by others before me, by the ambassador, but also by Michele. So in terms of knowledge, awareness, our survey indicate that by now, few weeks, in some time, even more than 1 month into the crisis, refugees and migrants are indeed well aware of the virus. Even though this proportion is still lower in some country compared to others, for instance, 20% of respondents in West Africa, they're not yet well aware of the virus, and then, for instance, all the symptoms associated to it and of the preventive measure. When it comes to protective measures taken by refugees and migrants, also these vary widely across the region, and then it is mostly linked to the possibility for people to stay at home and isolating from others. Of course, this is not possible everywhere. In some regions, for instance, in Latin America, this seems to be more possible than in others, such as, for instance, West Africa, where quite a lot of people that we'll be interviewing reported not to be able to isolate themselves from others. In West Africa, the percentage of people that declare not to be able to stay at home and self-isolate is up to 90%, whereas this percentage is less than 10 in Latin America. Just to give you an example, we have included the data about Asia only in the global update that we're going to publish now, because we start a bit later there. And Asia, from this perspective, seems to be a bit of an outlier, meaning that refugees and migrants in Asia seems to be particularly well informed about the virus, about what they have to do, and then they seems to be saying that they mostly manage to take the preventive measures that are needed. We have been trying to understand and think about why, and then we think that it's probably linked to the fact that in Asia, indeed, there is a bit of a culture of dealing with such pandemic, as it's been in the case in the past with SARS or with the bird flu. When it comes to source of information on coronavirus for interview refugees and migrants, also in this case, there are a bit of difference between the region, but something that comes out quite clearly across the board is that national authorities, national government are the source of information that are more used by refugees and migrants, and also more trusted compared to information on other topics. Very often when it comes to migration, contrary to those for COVID, it seems that state authorities are really trusted by most of the people we are interviewing. When it comes to yes,
thanks, Roberto. Sorry, we were just checking the time and maybe the final comments, and then we'll come back to you as we move to the next speakers, as we're running short on time.
Yeah, I can close with the I think access to healthcare, which is probably of interest for participants. So for access to healthcare, and particularly the barriers, as mentioned by Michele, discrimination is quite an important barrier to access. Not everywhere, mostly in North Africa, is less mentioned in West Africa, for instance, and then basically not at all in Asia, where it seems not to be the case. In other places, lack of documentation is an important barrier, for instance, in Latin America. And then the sort of overarching barrier that we, of course, see across all regions is lack of money, which is an important barrier in all regions where we conduct the survey. And this is very much linked to the very last point that I wanted to make, that is also what Michele said. When we ask people what has been the impact of COVID on the day-to-day life, the overwhelming majority of people that we interview report reduced access to work. And then the overwhelming majority of people also indicate that this has meant for them lack of basic income for them, which has reduced the possibility for them to send remittances home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roberto. We appreciate that. And maybe when we come back to the first round of questions, we'll also come and touch on some of these things. We really appreciate the work of the MMC done and the extensive interviews and the updates that you've been sending. So that has been really helpful. We turn now to Ivonne Garza from the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health. The O'Neill Institute is actually based at the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And is set up to respond to the needs of innovative solutions to the most pressing national and international health concerns. So Ivonne, this is particularly interesting to us in how when we look on the health side of things, we thought it might be really interesting for you to start off by briefly explaining some of the elements of the right to health and what migrants in particular, just in general, are facing in realizing that right to health.
Yes, hi. Well, thank you, Colin, for this introduction, and thank you, the International Council for Voluntary Agencies and the International Migrants Bill of Rights Initiative for the invitation to participate of this very interesting and fruitful discussion. As you explained, the right to health is enshrined in Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, and it establishes the right of every person to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. This right is composed by 4 interrelated and essential elements, as the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights explained on its General Comment 14, which addresses the right to the highest attainable standard of health. And these elements are, first, availability, which means to have available resources in sufficient quantity. The second element is accessibility, which means that the right must be accessible to everyone without discrimination, including being affordable and geographically accessible. The third element is acceptability, which means that the right must be acceptable, including ethically, culturally, and with respect for privacy. And this is especially important for the case of migrants. And the fourth element is quality, which means that the right must be of good quality and scientifically appropriate. As such, the General Comment 14 offers 3 key principles: the principle of equality and non-discrimination, the principle of participation, and the principle of accountability, which means basically that governments must provide access to health services, that public engagement with health policies must be meaningful and significant, and that governments must be answerable to the public on its implementation of the right to health. States have basic core obligations that are also explained in this General Comment 14, and these briefly are: the first, to provide for essential primary health care; the second, to provide access to health facilities, goods, and services; the third, to provide access to the minimum essential food and freedom of hunger; 4, to provide access to basic shelter, housing, sanitation, and adequate supply of safe and potable water; 5, to provide access to drugs and medicines; 6, to provide equitable distribution of all health facilities, goods, and services; and the 7th core obligation is to provide adequate implementation of a national public health strategy and plan of action. All of these, of course, become especially or more important in the framework of COVID-19. And it is important to mention that the Syracuse principles establish that in the case of emergencies, this right to health must be protected, and some other rights can be limited as long as it is temporary. And one of these rights that can be limited as a result of the objective of pursuing a safeguard to the right to public health is the right to transit and circulation of movement. So this is especially relevant for migrants. I just want to mention that all of these standards have been also reaffirmed by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And I mention this because the court, in terms of comparative law, our region has been having a really good development with dynamic litigation on the right to health. And two cases are landmark cases for these rights. In case someone is interested in consulting, is the Cusculpi-Barral case against Guatemala and the Poblete Vilches case against Chile, both of 2018, where the court has analyzed the right to health. Now, which are the challenges for the realization to the right to health for migrants in general? I'd say that we have observed throughout the years challenges to access to adequate sanitary conditions and food and water in shelters and detention centers, access to alternative measures to the deprivation of liberty, access to health services in general, including mental health, which is especially relevant in this context, and in the case of women, access to health and sexual reproductive healthcare in shelters and in general. And of course, access to treatment for the LGBTI population, migrant population.
Thank you so much for that, Ivonne. And Now turning specifically to COVID-19, I think, based on the work that you've done, what is the impact COVID-19 is having on migrants' rights? You've outlined some of these basic rights and some of the conditions of that. But now within the COVID-19 pandemic, what are some of the issues that migrants are having in terms of assessing and enjoying the highest attainable standard of physical as well as mental health?
Yes, so I would like to start by saying that the COVID-19 pandemic has gradually worsened the challenges that migrants normally face, and it has aggravated significantly the impact to physical and mental health of migrant persons around the world and in the region. And I thought about three main challenges that have been especially relevant, and Michele has also mentioned them. So the first is access to protection status, as shutdowns and lockdowns and governments are partially functioning due to the response to the pandemic. Access to protection status and procedures has been delayed in many countries, leaving migrants and asylum seekers in a state of legal uncertainty and increased vulnerability. Many of these persons are dropping off their claims or being deported or being left to await without a response for an unknown amount of time. As many states also continue with deportation procedures, this clearly goes against the duty to protect migrants, but also to the principle of the right of non-refoulement, which means to protect migrants in any situation. This has been especially relevant in the case of the US, where asylum procedures have been halted in many cases, and many migrants are still awaiting in the border with Mexico. It has also been the case of the Mexican system, where the Comar is currently also not advancing as fast as it should in having procedures being resolved. And also especially relevant in the case of Venezuela, where there has been a massive amount of people returning to Venezuela, and almost 58% of Venezuelans in Colombia are in irregular status, which means that they need a solution to be regularly in Colombia while the pandemic evolves. The same situation has been in Peru. Just to say an example, between March 15 and May 11, 31,000 Venezuelan migrants left Peru. So this gives us an idea of how much persons are moving around the region and trying to return to Venezuela to their families in the midst of the pandemic. And meanwhile, measures are required to provide them protection. And Colombia has taken some measures which are good practices. They decided to extend the status of those persons who had a permanent temporary protection status. So even if the status is expired through some legislation and decree, the government has decided to extend the time of these permits in order to ensure regular status for migrants and access to health in Colombia. Another concern is the conditions at detention centers, camps, or containment or quarantine centers. As procedures continue also to be adopted, measures continue to be adopted in the midst of the pandemic, and borders remain closed, migrants are left for indefinite time in detention centers or shelters, where conditions of access to sanitation measures and other basic needs like food and water are questionably limited. They clearly do not meet the standards and place people at greater risk of getting sick. Reports of these situations have emerged with regards to conditions in the United States and Mexico, as well as in Guatemala and El Salvador. In the case of the US, there have been reports of COVID outbreaks and deaths, including reports of suicide from migrants who have underlying conditions and were requesting to be placed in liberty, but have been getting rejection answers from authorities. And this is especially relevant for, as I said, not only for physical health, but also for mental health, which we can think of that if we are observing lack of basic sanitation measures in these centers, we can imagine that access to mental health services is more limited. And we know of reports of this as well. And finally, as Michele mentioned, another concerning situation is the right to return. The closure of borders due to the pandemic has derived in a very important and concerning situation, which is the possibility of migrants to return to their own countries. There are some countries, like the case of Bolivia, that completely shut down entry to its own nationals, and migrants were stranded in the northern area of Chile with impossible situation to come back to Bolivia. And same conditions sometimes, even if decrees expressly say that this is not a right that is limited, in practice, it has been limited by the closure of airports or other transportation services. So this is the case, for example, of El Salvador, which it is not expressly limited, but people have been not able to enter the country. And this, well, also has a collateral consequence, which is that once authorities or countries have authorized to entry or have placed measures to allow for entry, they have decided to quarantine or place persons in camps in border cities which are also not complying with sanitary conditions and standards established by international law. So what measures should be taken? And I'm wrapping up with this. International organizations, including UNHCR, the Inter-American Commission, and the Inter-American Court, have urged states to ensure access to asylum and protection mechanisms, as well as to adopt measures to ensure regular status, to ensure the adoption of alternatives to the deprivation of liberty, and to ensure access to sanitary services, including routine checkups and health specialists availability in shelters and detention centers, and to ensure the right to return, adopting measures to guarantee that sanitary conditions are taken within the measures to ensure this right. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ivonne, and really appreciate you also touching on some of the measures that have been undertaken by some of the countries, particularly in South America, on this. We turn now to Ian at IMBR, the National Migrants Bill of Rights. And Ian, Ivonne was just talking about some of these measures taken. What are some of the other initiatives, particularly in terms of the principles that can be undertaken to uphold the rights of migrants, particularly, overall in the face of this current pandemic, and some of the processes involved in that?
Thank you so much, Colin, and thank you to the co-organizers and panelists. It's wonderful to participate in this discussion, and that it will be available as a recording to distribute throughout civil society. I wanted to highlight one particular set of principles that we've heard throughout the call of multilateral efforts, including by UN agencies and the UN Network on Migration, to highlight the applicability of rights, including the right to access to territory, the right against return, rights of liberty and security of person. And in conjunction with a number of academics around the world, the Cornell, so both the International Migrants Bill of Rights Initiative, which I direct, which focuses on promoting the research on the rights of migrants and fostering opportunities for action and innovation, paired with the Zolberg Institute at the New School and the Program on Forced Migration at Columbia Health Center, to bring together experts from around the world, including Walter Kalin, Chiloka Bayani, Jane McAdam, a number of others who are prominent experts in the field of migration and refugees, to try to identify a set of key principles that would respond to what we saw as flashpoints in the state response to COVID, and articulate exactly how the international human rights framework that already exists applies to migrants, to refugees, and to internally displaced persons. So really articulating some key principles of rights in the context of mobility across all of those groups. So we've ended up with 14 principles that are grounded in the core obligations as well as regional human rights treaties and practice. And those are the equal treatment and non-discrimination, the right to health, highlighting state obligations to combat stigma, racism, and xenophobia, addressing restrictions on movement between states and within states, articulating principles of non-return and access to territory, enforcement of immigration law, including migrant detention, the right to protection of life and health of persons in camps, collective shelters, and settlements, rights to information, to the protection of privacy, addressing gender considerations, the rights of marginalized groups, labor rights, and then specifics on the content of the rights as they relate to limitations and derogations, which have been mentioned. And I articulate all of those that you'll see in the handout section of the webinar, that there's the complete set of principles. And I just want to highlight a couple. First, to really underscore the cornerstone, which is the right to be free from discrimination. So non-discrimination, of course, a key principle in the international system, from the UN Charter through all of the core human rights instruments, including the Refugee Convention. And so with just taking that example, what we've tried to do is articulate a short description of exactly how the legal obligation applies in the context of COVID. So we've wanted that to be short and practical and apply it to the context of COVID. So that means boiling it down to the context in which the rights of migrants, refugees, and the displaced are at risks, and then also highlighting the key tests. So in non-discrimination in the document, you'll see a discussion of states' failure to address the health needs of migrants, and that it would constitute discrimination because it would be unreasonable, disproportionate, pursue no legitimate goal, and threaten the well-being of the community. So in underscoring that, I also want to just highlight a few others. We focus on the right to health, though that I hope would support arguments about access to healthcare, including to vaccination, addressing quarantines, and to support arguments that they can't be discriminatory and must be limited and constrained to public health purposes. Right to information, underscoring that migrants too must have access to health information in this context. To privacy, so supporting limitations on sharing private information in the context of contact tracing as well as digital tracking. Immigration enforcement and detention, so supporting arguments for a moratorium and also release from detention. And workers' rights, supporting arguments that migrants must have access to protection on the same basis as nationals and can be exposed to additional risks without protective equipment. So in that respect, I think the principles seek to be comprehensive, but also to present the information in a way that will be maximally useful by all stakeholders, particularly civil society.
Thanks very much, Ian, for introducing and discussing the principles and summarizing some of that content and some of the details. In terms of what civil society as well as other stakeholders and states can do and how we can share this document and how we can use that, can you discuss that and give us some ideas a little bit and the applicability of that?
Certainly, Colin. And I certainly welcome innovation in this field, but I want to return to one of the comments that His Excellency began our discussion with, which is the importance of solidarity and multilateralism as we think about the post-pandemic response. And in that respect, I think principles like this can very much help states, help multilateral institutions, but also help civil society ground the discussion of the post-pandemic in the existing commitments that states have already made and the existing architecture that exists to facilitate cooperation that's protective of migrants and refugee rights. In a certain way, this is the same story of soft law development that we've seen in recent decades, where civil society has been so successful in pushing the multilateral agenda towards a rights-respective approach. And I think that that's exactly how these principles could be useful in the context of COVID by supporting, one thing I didn't mention is that these principles have now been formally endorsed by close to 1,000 academics from around the world, and you'll see in the document academics from every region. And so in that sense, I think that these principles can be useful to remind states of the cornerstone of any response, the cornerstones of non-discrimination when they think about access to healthcare and the right to health, and the like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I think we had very comprehensive presentations, and it was great to hear that all of the speakers emphasized on the same points throughout their presentations. And we shared with you today some of the many concerns that migrants face due to these pandemics. But we also try to give some examples of solutions that are already practiced by some states, but also civil society. I see we are unfortunately running out of time, but I hope you will be able to stay for another 10 minutes with us online. We'll not have the time to go through all the questions that are asked in the chat box, but I would still like to ask at least 3 more questions to our panelists today. And maybe I would start with Michele, because I also had 1 more questions already for Michele, and these other questions in the chat box relates to that. Michele, there is a fear that we might expect some sort of return to bad practices as soon as borders are reopened and the global COVID-19 pictures improves. So how could we anticipate and ensure some of those measures, positive measures taken by states, are rendered permanent or more long-term? And what role do you see for civil society in here?
Thanks, Michele. I think on that question, we've actually been looking a little bit at the release from detention and seeing that there have been a number of member states of the EU who released migrants from detention. What can we also analyze as the response, and how do we look at that going forward? So I wanted to maybe just start very briefly with that, because this has provided already some reflection for us. We've seen that there might have been 3 factors that played a key role in helping migrants to be released. One would be a favorable political background. So for example, in the UK, one of these first countries to release migrants in the past 2 months, there's been years of advocacy against detention. And over the years, that advocacy has led to a cross-party consensus in the UK on the need to reduce the number of individuals in detention, which most likely helped pave the way for the decision just, in the past 2 months to release hundreds of people. A second factor has been coordination amongst civil society organizations. In countries where some of the first releases were ordered, such as the UK again and Spain, the release also has been facilitated by the joint advocacy and coordination amongst civil societies actors, as well as the ombudsperson, and especially in Spain. And I think the third factor for this particular issue of detention has been having an alternative. So civil society has been working for years in the European context, recent years, on trying to look at case management-based alternatives to detention, and developing pilot projects and showing that they can also work when you release people and put them in the community. So we think that probably all of these factors have led to that. There might be many more, but these are just some to highlight. And so I think it would be useful in all of the different areas. So that's alternatives, that's release from detention, but then also regularization. Next week, actually, the Global Coalition on Migration will hold a webinar on regularization to look to see what have been some gains in different global regions on this issue. What can we learn from them, and how can we take this forward? Other issues, we could also do some analysis. But I also wanted to say that we shouldn't also forget that some issues are present throughout the year might not be as visible and continue in this pandemic. And one of them is the situation of people who defend migrants, so human rights defenders. And we see that civil society actually continues to be victims of harassment, over-policing, and criminalization of solidarity. And in the European context, even in the lockdown, we've had cases in Calais in France where some volunteers have been fined for providing support to migrants living in informal camps. Some were arrested for one day because they filmed the evacuation of a camp. In Barcelona, there was an NGO that was fined for distributing food for people who were ineligible for state support. And Greece also has a new joint ministerial declaration which regulates NGOs working in the field of migration. And we believe that this will make it very difficult for NGOs to register and certify for their work on migration. And so there might be a chilling effect on civil society. So we have to be very attentive also to developments such as those that not only criminalize migrants, but that also criminalize those who try to provide them support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele. Very clear call from your side to civil society, but also states and other actors online about non-detention, non-criminalization, not only of migrants, but also, of course, of those assisting migrants, and then the call for regularization measures. Thank you, Michele, very much. I have a question that I think Jan would be the right panelist to answer on this. Jan, the question is, how would you consider the specific impacts on migrants and movement from new surveillance technology, immunity passports and border health screenings? Will studies be conducted by civil society organizations and universities to assess implications on the rights?
Yes, thank you very much, Mirella and colleagues. I think in this respect, there are really two separate issues, although they are interrelated. And the context of the use of technology at borders is a very complicated one. I want to underscore, at least as far as I understand, and certainly I'm not a public health expert, but the very question of an immunity passport or using a sort of antibody regime for limiting mobility continues to yet have a basis in science. The current WHO guidance suggests that there's not yet an adequate science base for immunity passports, and continue to be serious concerns about any regime that would attempt to use such a mechanism to limit mobility, including because many of the tests that could detect the novel coronavirus could detect a number of other things, including the common cold. And so, in that respect, any regime that would attempt to use something like that to limit mobility really must be science-based, and in doing so can't reduce access to territory or trigger refoulement. So there we see non-refoulement and the right to seek and enjoy asylum as two very important cornerstone rights that must be balanced in the context of such new technologies. The implementation can't be racist, xenophobic, or discriminatory, so it must have a structure that is proportional to the public health demands. And in this respect, it's important to recall the application of the right to health that we've heard about through this, and that for example, the imposition of such screening or testing at the borders must ensure the right to health of arriving migrants, and then also can't abridge other rights, such as the right to the best interest of the child or to family unity. So here there are complicated areas where a number of key rights, fundamental protections that states have already agreed to and are widely adopted in national law must be brought to bear in the context of new technology. In the context of issues like surveillance and digital tools, and I think the principles that I was discussing earlier really focus on the importance of consent, voluntary consent to the use of identifying information as the rights-based cornerstone in the context of contact tracing, and then as to the use of technology for tracking, that it It really should only be used in very limited circumstances where the information isn't obtainable directly from the person, and where it will be used to enable contact tracing and not other purposes.
Thank you very much, Jan. And of course, I would say this is an issue that does not impact only on the rights of migrants, but it affects everyone and needs to be followed carefully. And as you said, every measure should be based on evidence and should be proportional and necessary. Otherwise, it will have a negative impact in terms of human rights in general. Thank you very much, Jan. I have one last question for Ivonne. Ivonne, you were mentioning some specific situations in the Americas, and one of the questions says that during this COVID-19 pandemic, migrants are stranded in many places in their way back to the country of origin or in the way to country of destination. Is there any specific initiative for stranded migrants undertaken by any authority that could be replicated by other relevant authorities? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Mira. So we have been witnessing two types of responses in general. One has been a response through diplomatic channels through which countries collaborate to ensure that their nationals can have means of transportation. So such is the case, for example, between Mexico and Argentina, the countries which coordinated through their foreign ministries the transportation of Mexicans who were stranded in Argentina and Argentinians that were stranded in Mexico through flights organized by the government. And there have been several flights. It was not only one. There was one at the beginning, in the first weeks of the emergency, and then some weeks ago a second one. So it has been a continuous effort from governments. That is one type of response that we've seen in the region. And the other type of response is a response that has been mostly pushed through media pressure or the pressure of international attention to a situation. So that is the case, for example, of Bolivia, in which after the situation of the Bolivians that were stranded in the northern part of Chile became or gathered public attention in the media, the government adopted a measure to ensure that this population that was approximately 400 persons could return to Bolivia. And one question or an aspect of this response that is important to take into consideration is the governments are always asking, okay, how do we ensure the right to public health while ensuring the right to return? And in that sense, they are adopting measures such as quarantining people at border cities. And this is very concerning as well, because it must be thoughtfully cared of and designed to ensure that people who will be quarantined for 14 days in a certain area can have access to water, to sanitary services, to health services and doctors. And this was not the case in Bolivia. So it is good that these persons were allowed to return to the country, but a lot of aspects of the way in which they were forced to quarantine in the border city are still being revised. Because, for example, there were some women who were pregnant and did not have access to health services in that specific area, which was really isolated from the urban city areas of Bolivia. So I would just emphasize on the need to ensure that any measures that are adopted for return care for health and sanitary procedures according to international standards that can ensure not having another outbreak of COVID within the population who is already in a very vulnerable situation.
Thank you very much, Ivonne. And unfortunately, with that, we've kind of really passed our time, so we might have to wrap up now. I just want to remind everyone that we have been recording this entire webinar from the start, and that will be available very shortly as the system processes it. If you've registered for the webinar, you'll receive an automatic email indicating that the recording is now available, and you can just click a link and access the webinar at any time to review any parts of the webinar. So just a reminder that will be made available very shortly. I'm also reminded that the UN Network will be holding a listening session on detentions tomorrow at 2 different times tomorrow. Please contact the UN Network directly. I believe the email to contact is unmignet@iom.int. We'll just type it in the chat box there to be sure. But again, we just really want to thank everybody for attending and staying on. I particularly want to thank Ambassador Omar Hilale from Morocco, Michele LeVoy from PICUM, Ivonne Garza from the Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law, Ian Kysel from IMBR, and Roberto Forin from MMC for speaking today and for being the panelist. We really want to thank you for your inputs, for answering as many questions as you could, and for bringing forward a lot of the thinking and how we can approach these questions. We want to thank you all for attending, and I want to thank my co-organizers, ICVA and IMBR, for organizing this webinar. Thank you all again.
Thank you, and stay safe.